Welcome, everybody. Welcome, Krupa, Daniel, and George.
Hey, nice to be here.
Hello, hello.
Great to see you all. So we are right on time today, and we'll wait for a few of the participants to enter. And while we're doing that, let's do our introductions around the table. So today's webinar is how to navigate the biggest risks in vendor and contract lifecycle management to unlock cash flow. Unlocking cash flow is going to be a really, really important theme throughout this webinar session today. And when we talk about vendor and contract lifecycle management, we might sometimes refer to that throughout this webinar as VCLM, which is just an abbreviation for vendor and contract lifecycle management. So in case any of you saw my LinkedIn post last week, I am super, super excited to have these three experts on our panel discussion today. As I said, simply because of the range of expertise that we have around this table. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Krupa Patel to you. So Krupa is head of procurement at Funding Circle, which is actually the UK's leading small business lending platform. Krupa is actually a thought leader in procurement, and she has revolutionized the way they manage vendors at Funding Circle, creating significant positive impact, which we're excited to share more about with you shortly. We also have George Chandler on the call. George is an accountant by trade and ex-auditor, and George's experience as a financial controller and head of corporate finance has led him to his current role, where he is a senior consultant at the leading ERP NetSuite, which is actually Gatekeeper's preferred strategic partner as an ERP as well. And then we also have Daniel Barnes. Daniel is a seasoned procurement and contract management leader. Daniel actually has a master's in commercial law from the University of Southampton. And he, I know, is on a mission to transition the sector from the manual spreadsheet-driven processes to much more efficient, automated operations. And Daniel's also the community leader at Gatekeeper. It's really important that we obviously set the intention of this webinar today. And our intention is to spend the next only 35 minutes or so to bring you really straight to the point information, which is going to set you up for success when you're managing your vendors or suppliers and your vendor contracts. And when I say setting you up for success, what I mean is that we want to use the experience that we have around this virtual table today to get really, really crystal clear on exactly how they have unlocked cash flow and created so much success through the way that they've either managed their vendors and contracts or advised businesses on how to manage their vendors and contracts. So I wanted to begin with why. Like, why should businesses or CFOs specifically be prioritizing vendor and contract management as a mission critical part of what they do? And I came across this stat recently, which is pretty staggering. And it said that the World Commerce calculated that poor contract management practices are costing businesses an average of 9% revenues each year. So that means if your revenue, for example, is around £20 million, poor contract management is costing you 9% of that each year, which is, of course, £1.8 million every single year. And so the very first question I want to ask is to you, Daniel. Where is that leakage coming from, and what exactly is so costly when it comes to contract management?
Yeah, sure. And that figure that you actually gave there is an improvement in the last 5 years. The figure was slightly worse about 5 years ago when they released their first report on this. And fundamentally, it's down to poor contract management in two particular phases. So we have like two distinct phases: pre-signature and post-signature. So everything up until the contract is signed, and then everything afterwards. So that's typically all of your performance management activities, SLAs, KPIs, all that cool stuff there as well. But just if I drill down into the two key things that I see in the pre-signature phase, there's a lot of just poor processes and poor ways of working with contracts. And the two things I've seen time and time again, in multiple different sectors, is people signing up contracts with really unbalanced terms. So if you rely on your vendor terms and you don't put enough effort, let's say, into reviewing them, you can get really caught out with poor clauses, and that could be around, payment clauses, it could be indemnification, limit of liabilities, things like that, that really make you, perhaps need to go and get a higher insurance limit, which costs you somewhere further down the line. And then there's another issue of scope. And what I mean by that is, like, are you actually getting what you think that you're paying your vendors for? And too often we see this thing called scope creep, right? So we engage with a vendor, we get a particular service, or I'm just going to use services for this example because it's kind of easier. And we expect the service provider to come in and do some piece of work for us. But typically, if we haven't scoped it, if we haven't written that document, and it might be like a schedule of work, a statement of work, if we haven't captured everything in there, it's often the case that the vendor will say, oh, if you want to do X, Y, and Z, that wasn't included, so we're going to now need to charge you more, and they're kind of locked in. So you end up just, even if you've completed that work, you end up paying more and more further down the line. And then from the post-signature phase, there's one area that I think a lot of organizations really struggle with, and that's their renewals process. And I think everyone's probably seen it. Auto renewal clauses are very typical in pretty much every software contract, but they've actually found their way into other types of contracts. So by a set date, if you've not served notice to your vendors, you will incur a new invoice and a new contract term. And just having something that can tell you actively that that is coming up, and you can then act on that, you can stop that auto renewal, or you can renegotiate it, can save ridiculous sums of money. So I've seen too many organizations waste thousands just by letting auto renewals happen. So I'll stop there, because otherwise I'll talk to this point all day otherwise.
No, that's fascinating. Thank you. So I mean, and Creeper, for you as well, at Funding Circle, before you changed the way things were working at Funding Circle, what do you think were some of the common problems that you were experiencing around managing vendors and vendor contracts, and what was the impact that was having on the business?
Yeah, great question. I think there's a number of things that, when I first joined, we didn't really have any established processes or governance structures. So there was a lot of work for us to do as a procurement team. And I think that's like the key, isn't it? It's like if we have no process, the business doesn't really know how to manage their contracts or where to store them. And it just then leads to like a real lack of visibility and control. So we absolutely saw that there were some contracts that would just sit within various functions and we didn't know about them, and then people would leave the organization and then they're not really handed over to somebody, and these contracts are just auto renewing without us being aware or being able to be proactive with them. So I think that was a real big step change for when we kind of implemented Gatekeeper. And then another part of it was really around like contract ownership. So there are certain contracts that we use across different functions. So, where that happens, it's like so-and-so might think another department is managing it, and then they think vice versa, the other person's managing it, and actually no one's doing anything. So with implementing Gatekeeper, we've really been able to nail down who looks after what and what their accountabilities are and the responsibility, and then it makes it life easier for procurement to then kind of follow up with the right people and take it from there. So I think there was a lot of progress we've made actually over the past couple of years, just with our processes, structures, and the systems.
Yeah, I think Jamie's just joined. I think he's joined a panelist link somehow. That's really interesting. So, Creeper, you mentioned visibility there. Before you had everything in place, do you what percentage of your contracts do you think that you actually had full visibility over? Do you think that you actually had a good grasp of where all your contracts were and what the clauses were within them?
I don't think we had any visibility over our contracts. That we were relying on the business a lot to say, where is this? When does it expire? Do we need a lot of these licenses? Are we still using them all? We're relying on the business to tell us those pieces of information. And actually, without those conversations, we wouldn't learn. But then the business's responsibility is the other part of their actual jobs, and contract management isn't their priority. So sometimes they don't even know the answers to those because they may have inherited those contracts. So sometimes the business didn't really know what we'd signed up for. So I think procurement did have to step in, do a lot of the data cleansing, and really gain that visibility to then have the control and make a positive change.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fascinating because a stat that I came across recently as well is that 71% of businesses can't locate at least 10% of their contracts. And that actually sounds like it's quite a conservative figure, because a lot of the businesses we speak with have exactly the same situation as you, where they're storing they're storing their contracts everywhere and nowhere, and they're relying on the rest of the business for it. And actually, if we go back to that idea of auto-renewing contracts, if you've got contracts that are auto-renewing and you don't even know where the contracts are, you're never going to be able to manage that. So it's a really great point. Thank you. And so over to George as well. So George, as we know, is a senior consultant at NetSuite. And George, as well, in your previous or former career, you were an accountant, a financial controller. You actually did the auditing role, right? So you've got a lot of really, really great experience from that angle. With your kind of accounting and auditing hat on, when you were working with businesses, where did you see most of the bleeding cash coming from when it came to supplier management?
Yeah, I think it stems from a lot of what Daniel and Krupa have said already around just control being the key point. You know, if you don't have control about where you're spending things or who you're spending it with, you might find, you know, businesses might find that if they've not reviewed those vendor records or lists for a long time, they might be spending money where they don't need to. They might be spending money twice in terms of, you know, with one supplier for one thing, with another supplier for another thing. They may not have control over the stuff that they're buying as well. So they might be, you know, buying it from one person at one rate when they actually could get a much better preferential rate from somewhere else, which then leads into the second piece, which is probably around relationship management. You know, if you can't keep track of where you are spending and when you are spending and when you should be spending stuff, it's very, very difficult to then build those relationships with those suppliers, so that, you know, you might be getting fined for late payment, or they may not be giving you those preferential rates potentially. So by potentially sacrificing a little bit of working capital up front and maybe paying suppliers a little bit earlier, or investing into systems that allow you that visibility, you're probably going to save a lot more in the back end, because you're going to be getting potentially better rates. You're going to be spending less overall on stuff you don't need. And then of those suppliers that you do end up choosing, it's around, again, that risk management strategy as well. So you're going to want to make sure that all of your due diligence is done on those particular suppliers. So, you know, if one of those suppliers has a data breach or a cyber breach or something like that, they might get fined. Some of those fines might get passed on to you as a business, you know, and so you're then bearing the cost of not doing your due diligence up front. And then the final piece, which I think we'll probably talk around later, is around what you mentioned there, around where all of that data is stored and the ease of getting to that data, and therefore the cost implications later down the line. So if you know, when you have your statutory audit at the end of the year, as easy as you can make it for those auditors to check that information, they're going to love that. They're going to spend less time with you as a business, and therefore probably, hopefully, your audit fees are going to be a bit lower as well.
I'm super interested in the compliance piece that you brought up again, and you can see I've got really statistic research happy in the time that we spent apart, because I just really find that when we speak with businesses for the first time and they start to do their implement like vendor and contract management processes, they often feel like they're the only ones that are experiencing the same kind of thing. But you really hit the nail on the head when you were talking about the compliance, because when businesses get fined, often it's not necessarily something that's happened that they've done. It's something that someone, like someone in the third party supply chain has actually had a data breach. And I was just looking at news headlines that are popping up again and again, where third party breaches, it's to do with like fines come from third parties rather than themselves, or halts in supply chain, or regulatory issues and things like that. So it's happening all the time, and large businesses are really kind of feeling the brunt of these fines from this. So yeah, the question really is, what do we do? What do we need to put in place to solve this? And this question is going back to Daniel again. So what do you think, Daniel, are the fundamental must-haves or steps, and in what order, if possible, to make sure that you need to manage vendors well?
Yeah. Like, there's a million and one directions we can go in here. But like, one thing I think is paramount that needs to be done is that alignment across the entire organization. And a lot of vendor-facing teams typically do report into a CFO. So making sure you are aligned with what your CFO is also trying to achieve is great. That might be cost reduction, to the points that were just made there. It might be risk reduction, could be a primary focus, right? So that's really going to change kind of your approach to vendors, and maybe even the investment you can get. George just mentioned maybe a bit of money spent upfront, maybe to pay vendors better, so you can build up those better relationships and hopefully find some more trustworthy friends, let's say, out there. Or it might be getting tech that helps with a multitude of problems. I really liked your previous slide, Emily, because I read somewhere recently that 98% of organizations have had at least like 2 or 3 vendors have a cyber attack. And I know one thing we are seeing in the regulatory space as well is that a lot of protections in supply chain have been around like physical providers, so service providers or of goods, and now it's all of that's now moving to the digital supply chain, which has sort of escaped a lot of regulatory control. So I think having an alignment with your CFO and ultimately the rest of your business, being on top of compliance, which is very difficult. Like, I'll be honest, it's super hard, but it's going to come out of some of the points that Krupa and George made, like good due diligence, knowing where your contracts are, building in the right clauses. And then I think it does fundamentally come back to have good processes in place, have good policies in place, but don't necessarily just rely on them, because I've worked in organizations where they say they have policies and processes in place, but no one in the organization knows how to work them. No one knows how to raise a request. You really need to put this at the heart of everything. And I always think like too many processes and policies are made for like procurement people, or vendor facing people, and you really need to make everything about your colleagues who need to raise these requests, who need to use these services. So really get talking with them, figure out what they like, what they dislike, and then build from there is a good approach. I'll stop talking here because I think Krupa and George will have some better things to say than me on top of that.
No, I think that's really, really useful. And I think the biggest takeaway there is that it's a cross-company collaborative exercise. It's not just down to the finance team or down to the legal team to make all the decisions around it. But I would love to ask Krupa, knowing what you know now, what would be your blueprint for success for making sure that you do vendor and contract management right?
Yeah, great question. I think definitely it boils down to like just obtaining control and getting that visibility. Like, that's the very first step that I think organizations need to focus on, and that is all about just obtaining the necessary data and maintaining it, keeping it accurate. And I think a system is fantastic. It allows you to manage things going forwards, but until you've got your foundational information and the data integrity there, it's not really going to reap any rewards. So you spoke about supply due diligence, and that's a huge part of our onboarding process. So it's not just about collecting data on the contracts and the content of the contracts, such as like the start dates, end dates, and notice periods and all that, but also around like keeping our supplier contact details up to date, so we know how to make sure we're getting the up-to-date due diligence and assurances in place to avoid those kind of risks that come up every day. So I think that's a huge part of any kind of VCLM tool. And I think sometimes when you start a project like this, sometimes you can feel like, oh yeah, it's easy, we can just quickly get it done. But you're right, it is a collaborative exercise with so many people involved. And then going on the back of that point, it's all about like mapping those contracts to contract owners,
And out of interest, for businesses out there who are at the stage where they've mapped out their contract owners, how frequently are you catching up with the contract owners to get information on like feedback loop of what's happening with those vendors?
Yeah, so I mean, generally our contracts, vary in length. So I like to catch up with all our stakeholders like on a monthly basis, or the key high contract areas, because things change, like the supply performance changes, and we need to keep on top of all of those activities just to make sure, actually, are we still getting great value for money from this contract? Because I think sometimes the business owners may forget that actually this is costing us money. They're not just providing a service for the sake of it, we're actually paying for it. So we need to make sure we're getting what we've paid for, and they're delivering, and the uptime is still there, and we're getting great customer service. So yeah, like we catch up monthly, we talk about contracts that are coming up, contracts that we need to negotiate, contract, and then supply performance as well, in terms of how do we see this relationship moving forward.
And I just think this collaborative part is such an interesting topic, and a lot of the businesses that we deal with miss this. So I do just want to ask a couple more things on this. And the main thing I want to understand is, did your leadership team understand the commercial impact, or the positive commercial impact that doing procurement well or doing contract management well would have? Or is that something that you've had to educate around?
Yeah, I think it's something that as procurement people, we do need to spend time educating the leadership team to be like, look, yeah, this is a cost, but there's benefit here as well, and sometimes you don't see it straight away, but it comes over time. Like, you get better value for money over time. You can terminate contracts earlier, so you're then able to save money later down the line. You can't do everything immediately. I think also getting the business stakeholders on board can also be a challenge, because for them it's like more admin, like providing us data, understanding their contracts, and they just want to get on with their day jobs. This is just extra side work for them. So I do feel like, we need to really build those relationships to get the best value out of both internally and externally with our supply base.
Great point. Yeah, thanks. And George, now putting your auditing hat on, from an auditor's point of view, what do you think auditors really care about in terms of what are the most important things to them when they're making sure that businesses minimize their risks of around failing an audit or getting hefty fines?
Yeah, so I think when it comes to auditing the AP, the AP side of things specifically, and across the whole board, we'll sort of break it down into two bits. There'll be firstly a sort of controls based testing to make sure that the business is doing what it should be doing, etc. And then there's also more sort of substantive based testing, where we want to look at individual transactions to make sure they've gone to the right place and that they've, they're not fraudulent and all that kind of stuff. And typically speaking, if auditors can put more emphasis, or if they have more comfort in controls and the controls that a company has in place, they usually need to spend less time with the substantive testing element. So therefore, and that's where a lot of the bulk of the time can usually be spent. And so a lot of the sort of controls element then comes back to what Daniel and Krupa have been saying, which is around consistency, aligning processes across the board, across the business. And this becomes way easier when you're using the right systems, because a lot of those controls can just be baked into the system. It's a one rule sort of across the board, or, depending on different factors and things like that. And it becomes even easier still where if you've got multiple systems in play, they're speaking to each other intelligently. So again, you've just got that one version of the truth everywhere. So whether you're getting information, whether you an auditor starts in, say, a finance system like NetSuite, let's say, and then they say, right, well, we need to now have a look at this transaction. They can just go straight over, to Gatekeeper and have a look there, and you're looking at the exact same information. So again, having that joined up data in a very clean way is very, very important. And then secondly, on the controls piece, having some of that automated as well, whereby you could say, are things being signed off correctly? Have the right people had eyes on the transactions when they need to? Are you following things like double checking bank details with suppliers, for instance, that kind of thing, to make sure that bank details are correct and you're not fraudulently, knowingly or not knowingly paying people that you're not supposed to be? And fundamentally, all of that and making the auditors' lives easier as well is always going to be a win, because again, that's going to result in a better relationship with your auditors. It's going to result in potentially lower audit fees because they're having to spend less time. So yeah, it's just around having clean data and making sure that you've got consistent, auditable, checkable controls in place.
Great. Okay. So let's imagine that there's a business, and a business has around, let's say, 50 vendors or 50 contracts associated with vendors. And they currently manage those contracts on spreadsheets, and they know that it's becoming increasingly more manual. It's hugely administrative, like in terms of a burden on the administration side. And it's also really high risk because of like vendor compliance, but also they're bleeding cash because they're auto renewing contracts. And they're starting to think about this for the first time. The question is, to manage their expectations, how long does this mapping, or like how long should the mapping process take? Or how long, how should they be thinking about allocating time to think about that versus actually managing, like doing the day-to-day? Just for anybody who would like to answer.
I think it's always going to be, changing systems. It's always going to be work. You're changing processes across the board. It's going to be, it's hard work, but do it once. Therefore, do it once and do it right. So regardless of how long it takes, you think, okay, maybe let's pluck a number out of thin air. Let's say 6 months or something for a full procurement finance system change across the board. That's 6 months, yeah. It's additional work, and you've got to do your day job. But then after that's in place, the amount of time that everybody is going to save, and a lot of people, like you were saying, huge amounts of administrative tasks and operational work happening. Those people who no longer have to do those tasks can do more value add for the business. So you're looking then at almost like an exponential value curve, because you're not spending time doing this, plus you can spend actual value time adding, value to the business, looking for better deals on your supplier relationships and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's great. So, and on that leads us on to the next question, which is around, what is the impact when this is solved, when businesses can actually do this well? And we at Gatekeeper, we've seen many businesses gain seven-figure sums in terms of cost savings through better management of contracts. And so, Krupa, at Funding Circle, what was the impact like for you when you when you applied these methods and made that shift and started doing it in this better way?
I think there's a few key things really to discuss here. It's, the number one thing I think is contract ownership. If we don't know who's owning it, who's managing that supplier, how do we know what direction the business is going in and what are we trying to achieve? What are our business requirements for that contract? We can't negotiate with a supplier if we don't know what we need in the first place. So I think that was the first step, by having that contract ownership and people really being responsible for that one contract. It allows us to have more meaningful internal conversations. And then, then that kind of trickles into the next thing around, okay, fine, if you own this contract and that supplier is providing the same service as supplier B, then why do we need both of them? Right? Then you start identifying duplication, and then you're able to then rationalize your supply base. And then that leads into like, all right, what are the contract dates? How do we terminate? Which one do we want to keep? Which one do we want to terminate? And at what point do I need to do this by? Because, you know, you can't just terminate contracts whenever you feel like you don't want to use them anymore. And I think sometimes people do think you can work like that, and it's not. We are bound contractually, and we have dates to abide by. So by capturing that information, you're able to then terminate contracts proactively, make these decisions up front, and then, you know, reap the rewards at the end. So as George said, it may take 6 months to implement a system, but as time goes on, you're more aware of what your data is saying, where you've got negotiation power, and where you can really make these step changes in the business. So I do really believe in VC lentils providing that, you know, commercial benefit for all organizations.
It's great. Love that answer. Thank you. And so, yeah, in terms of that financial impact, how should CFOs and procurement professionals really be thinking about this? Because it's not just one aspect. It's not just saving from the auto renewals. It's like you said, George, right? It's that exponential long-term growth.
Yeah, 100%. And that's gonna, every business is gonna have to think about that at some point, you know, long-term implications of decisions. And so how those are going to play out over time. I mean, when we decided to replace our systems, we did a very simple exercise and just said, you know, let's look into this. Let's just spend a week and let's look into the data and see how it's changing. And we were staggered by some of the impacts that we saw there, whether it be some of the bits and bobs that we've seen, you know, operationally so far, you know, around auto renewal savings and all that kind of stuff, but also the amount of time that people were spending. And I think that can be quite difficult to quantify time. But then when you think, right, well, this person who is got all of this knowledge is spending all of their time doing something that isn't actually valuable at all for the business. You know, it is something that we can systematize. It's something that could be done way easier and way quicker. And then we can use all of that knowledge that they've got, that they've built up in the business. You know, they've maybe been in the business for years, to in a more sort of consultative way and say, right, well, how is that going to sort of pay dividends moving forward? So, you know, whether they're a procurement professional, we say, brilliant, let's reutilize that knowledge in the business to further increase our relationships with suppliers. And, you know, you might be able to see a downturn in overall direct costs or something with your suppliers over the course of, you know, a year or 2 years or something, which is going to increase your bottom line. So I think there's the immediate impacts around, you know, the immediate financial savings, but then the long-term impacts, I think, mainly are tied to efficiency savings in the business, is what I'd usually say.
And when businesses make those kind of savings, I guess this is, I mean, Daniel, obviously you used to be an actual practitioner yourself as well, so it would be good, maybe you've got an answer for this also, but when a business like yours, Krupa, makes that kind of savings, how do you use that additional newfound revenue, or all of those costs that you've reduced? What do you do with it?
Yeah, I think it just allows us to invest more in the product that we're selling onto our customers. And then also just like allows the procurement team to then focus on more category management, you know, forward-looking strategic projects. Like, where else do we have more value to add here? You know, it's not just about, you know, getting rid of people because we've made savings here and there, but it's about trying to give people the development they want from their careers, as well as like adding more value in the strategic side of things. You know, like there's always more to be done. There's always savings to be had further in different areas, and it's just uncovering the hood under a lot of those other areas that we don't always get time for if you're busy reading contracts that are, you know, locked away somewhere.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you. And great. So just about on time. So Daniel, I guess to close, what would be the key considerations that CFOs and all procurement pros really need to be thinking about as they sort of embark on this journey?
Yeah. I think everything everyone's already said, and Krupa, you made a really good point earlier on around like the education piece, and typically, you know, the perception of procurement teams in a lot of organizations is highly negative, right? Like it's like why are they here? They're just buying stuff. like we can do that. We do it every day. And they're actually just like to Krupa's point, they're just giving me a bunch of stuff to go do on top of my day job. So I think it's so critical though, to get like, get the right people across the organization as your champions. And I've always found like little pockets of them throughout the organization. It may not be the most senior person. I think it's very good to do that. Get the senior people on board. And I think the CFO is an absolute must-have ally within your organization. But just looking across and just kind of spreading good vibes about what you're trying to achieve and show that you're actually trying to help them, and you are coming back to that point of alignment, like we're all here to work together to do the same things. But also, like on the flip side, I will kind of put it on the CFO somewhat to recognize that if there's a huge opportunity within, say, our supply chains, whether that's a digital supply chain or whatever, the contract erosion figure that you gave at the start of like, around the 9% figure, in some organizations that figure is quite low. It's around 2%, but that's still a potential, huge amount of money to reclaim. But they actually gave a range in that report, and it was up to 20% plus. So there's a lot of organizations out there, really losing, like quite literally bleeding cash everywhere. And if the CFOs in those organizations, really want to help that business, I'd almost say look to the supply chain first and foremost, as opposed to just focusing on like your product and service and your price in there. Like there's so much money that you could reclaim with your vendors.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you. We've also got a vendor and risk management checklist where you can actually go through and just check against what you are doing versus what you aren't currently doing. That's a bit of a workbook. And if anybody would like to get in contact with any of us, I'll include our LinkedIn's, if that's all right with the team, in that follow-up email. And thanks again for joining, and thank you very much, Krupa, George and Daniel, for all of those amazing insights.